Today marks the start of the 2024 Paralympic Games, and over 2 weeks already since the Olympic closing ceremony in Paris. The physical demands and complexities of sport have never been clearer, but what's going on inside our brains when we exercise? Flaminia, thank you so much for joining me today. Your research and teaching focuses on how the brain and body interact during exercise. Why is this an important area to understand?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Lia. And I guess we care because we care about our brains. We want our brain to work well. I, for one, have 2 neurons left, and I'd like to make sure that they keep working throughout my adulthood.
I relate to that.
So it's important because we care, but let me give you a little bit of history before we go into the science. Have you ever heard of the Flynn effect?
No, I don't think I have.
It's named after the researcher who identified this effect. And essentially, Flynn studied IQ patterns from the early 1900s up until 1978 and found that IQ seemed to be rising. So we see an increase in IQ from early in the century all the way to the end. But what we're seeing now is actually the reverse Flynn effect. So he stopped studying IQ in about 1978 when he came up with this theory. And what we're actually seeing now, and what he didn't know, is that IQ has peaked when in people who were born in 1975. And what we're seeing now is that IQ is actually coming back down on certain tests. And other issues that have been on the rise since the 1970s are obesity and sedentary behavior, and this can probably be attributed to improvements in technology, mechanization of manual labor, etc. So what early research did in, let's say, 20 to 30 years ago, researchers started looking into whether there was a relationship between this rise in sedentary behavior and changes in brain function, essentially. And so that's where the exercise neuroscience field essentially started. So it's a very new field. It's growing very rapidly. And it does relate to aspects of our daily lives in all shapes, essentially. We've got performance and law enforcement workers, shift workers, so nurses, medics, behavior at school, making sure that children do interact with the lessons and are actually drawing something beneficial from them, supporting our brain throughout adulthood, and obviously our mental health, which is something that we're all quite focused on at the moment.
Maybe an effect we could see in the future is, I know I personally find it very strange to see kids kind of growing up on iPads and spending a lot of time on screens when they're very small, whereas I think I was probably one of the last generations who had their proper core childhood not on a screen, not on a computer, doing stupid stuff outside, running around, getting dirty and just wreaking havoc generally. But I guess that generation haven't yet grown up to the stage where we kind of see that effect in an adult. So is that kind of something that people in the field are looking out for when that generation grows up?
I love that you said that. And actually, yes, I do think the screen time and sedentary time in kids is really worrying. We are doing some really exciting research at the moment with children, and we are seeing relationship between brain development in kids and how physically active they are. So on one end, there are relationships just purely between executive function and physical activity. So how well kids are able to pay attention, to control their behavior, so their impulsivity, and to, I guess, make decisions and process information. But what's really exciting is what we want to try to understand is whether boring exercise is any better or worse than cognitively engaged exercise. You want to get the kids, like you said, running around in the fields, getting dirty, but around that, yes, there's a physical element. You're running around, you're raising your heart rate, but you're also engaging in lots of new processes. You're learning about new things, you're connecting with the environment, you're trying to focus on what's around you and interacting with objects. And all of that is important for lots of different processes in the brain that need to develop. There's the decision making and the memory, but also the motor skills. And I have to say, we are seeing a decline in fitness levels in students and in the younger generation in general. We don't quite know whether that's a COVID effect, and which has made us much more sedentary and has kept us at home for far too long. But we are concerned that that might be having an impact on brain development. So what we're starting to see at the moment is that exercise that is cognitively engaging does seem to help kids pay attention better and control their impulses. So I guess my advice to teachers and anyone who has to work with children, if you can get them to run around and jump up and down for 15 minutes before you sit them down, I can guarantee that they'll be in a much better place to engage with the lesson and pay attention.
You kind of touched on that exercise can help with executive function and motor skills, but could you tell us a little bit more about what's actually going on in our brains when we exercise and how that can help us develop?
Yes, lots is the short answer. There's so much that goes on in our brains and we still need to understand. So at a physiological level, there are hormones changing, there are neurotransmitter levels changing, but also from a cognitive level, there are different cognitive processes that we engage in. So hormones that have been identified recently and are a big focus in the field are BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is a hormone that supports neurogenesis, so the formation of new neurons, but also synaptogenesis, so the formation of new synapses. So it helps our brain function in the short term, so immediately after a bout of exercise, but it also, more importantly, supports our brain health in the longer term and in creating new neurons and new connections in our brain, which is why we start to see relationships between the onset of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline and fitness later in life, for example. From a neurotransmitter level, we've got our catecholamines change, that's a big one, so dopamine or adrenaline, and we know that has lots of different effects on how we feel, how well we are able to concentrate, and how much we're, enjoying our activity in that moment in time. People talk a lot about endorphins. Mm-hmm. And that's a controversial one in the field because it's unclear whether endorphins actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So whatever you're producing around systemically in your body, does it actually then go into the brain and do anything? So that's being researched at the moment. But a really exciting development in the field are endocannabinoids.
Oh, that's a long word.
It's a long word, and it sounds like cannabis because it's basically the same molecule, but we produce it ourselves. So endocannabinoids, endo for internal, it's a molecule that our brain produces, or it's a neurotransmitter, and it does give us that feeling of euphoria and just feeling good about ourselves. And what's really interesting is that there are adaptations in the endocannabinoid system in people who exercise quite a lot from an endurance perspective. So people who run will talk about the runner's high. And if you tell a person who does lots of strength training, they might be very, very fit, but you talk to them about the runner's high and they might say, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm miserable the whole time.
And that's interesting because our body adapts to different types of exercise, both our body and our brain. And there was this fantastic study done on mice, on animal models, so a pinch of salt, but they did show an adaptation in the endocannabinoid system where when the mice got fitter, there was, an improvement in the system so that the receptor availability increased, which means that the mice were getting a bigger boost from the exercise session, and I'm sure they were answering their mood questionnaires very accurately.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. But I guess the animal model study does show that there can be an adaptation and a change in the brain following exercise, which we can't study in humans. But there are human studies that just look cross-sectionally at relationships between the production of this neurotransmitter and how much a person exercises. And people who are quite fit from an endurance perspective do seem to produce more of this neurotransmitter. So I guess extrapolating from that, it's maybe reassuring that you might not enjoy running now, but if you kept running after a couple of months, your brain might actually adapt to that and get a bigger mood boost from that cardio session that you're really dreading at the moment.
I've just got Olympics on the brain at the moment. I'm sure a lot of people were as obsessed with it as I was. But when you kind of see someone who finishes the 1,500 meters, for example, or even a sprint, could it be this system that's coming into play?
Absolutely. I think they're definitely running on adrenaline. Mm-hmm. and this is where, so different sports they're so different and interesting between each other. So if you're thinking about sprinters, yes, there's the physical element. They just did, a 10-second sprint, and they're running on adrenaline, as we say. But there's also what we call the social facilitation effect. So sprinters will run in a stadium filled with tens of thousands of people. They're all staring at them. These types of athletes are likely to be extroverts, so they enjoy the human connection element of this, and you've got all these people supporting you, and so you've got the adrenaline and the rush of the run, as well as this facilitation effect from everybody around you. And what's quite funny is that even animals engage in this effect. So there is, I think the funniest study that I've seen is on cockroaches.
Ooh. I can't imagine finding cockroaches funny. They normally make me quite alarmed.
Well, luckily I didn't see the cockroach itself, but I thought what was very interesting about the study is they got cockroaches to complete, let's say, a distance on their own, or with a bunch of cockroaches around on either side, essentially watching them, or at least being around them. And when there was a cockroach audience, the cockroach ran faster than when there was no audience.
It's nice to know that we're not that different from a cockroach.
Yeah, that's very reassuring.
We're all the same.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. And then you've got, I suppose on the other end, if you look at marathon runners, you do see a bit of the opposite effect, though. I think they push themselves so far that they do kind of collapse towards the end of it.
Yeah.
Different sports will, I think, benefit in different ways from both the social element, the physical element. Shooting, as much as, we don't really think of that as a sport, but that you want the opposite. You want them to be calm. You want to make sure that they're able to concentrate on what they're doing. So there's lots of breath work involved in shooting. And cardiovascular health is incredibly important for it, because your heart you need to be able to control your heartbeats and to lower it. And in that context, the social facilitation might not work very well if you're an extreme introvert, or if you're prone to being quite anxious. Having people watching you might not be the best thing to do. So I think athletes are so diverse, and sports is such an interesting field because it involves so many different disciplines and aspects, all the way from, we've got the different types of performances, but also the different experts that contribute to sports, from the engineers to the psychologists to the nutritionists. So it's such a beautiful, well-rounded field to be working in.
It definitely has so much science that goes into it that I think maybe flies under the radar, or people just don't really think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, when you talk about riding on the shoulders of giants, you think the athletes will have such a team behind them. And even not the immediate team, but the engineers working on the best material for the track and their shoes. And so, yeah, and it is. So that, I think that's what I love about the field. It's so interdisciplinary, and you meet so many interesting people.
Going back to the physiological changes that you were talking about before, how is it that you actually measure this? What kind of equipment do you use to track those changes?
So what we do in our lab, we use something called FNIRS, functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It does not allow us to measure neurotransmitters, but what it does allow us to do is to look at hemodynamic changes in the brain, so changes in blood flow. The FNIRS device has optodes. These are near-infrared light optodes that shine infrared light into the brain or into the scalp, and they go about 2 centimeters deep. So we only really get a picture of what's happening in the cortex of the brain, which is fine, because for what we're interested in, if it's executive function or spatial cognition, the parts of the brain that are responsible for these mechanisms are quite superficial. So it's a very useful piece of equipment, and what's great is that it can be mobile. So you can stick a cap on somebody's head and allow them to walk around or engage with their environment, which you cannot do in an MRI scanner, because you're lying down. If someone's claustrophobic, it completely changes, how they're dealing with the stimuli. And it also, laying down in an MRI scanner, changes your blood pressure. It changes lots of physiological elements that mean that research that's done in a scanner isn't always translatable to sport or to the real world. So this is why the field is using this relatively new piece of equipment, which allows us to look into the brain while they're doing something that's relevant to running around on a field, essentially. If you wanted to go more specific, what hemodynamic changes allow us to understand is if we see changes in oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood in different regions of the brain, we know what parts of the brain are working during a specific task. That's important to us because exercise, it's not a case of I'm going to jump up and down and send blood to my brain and then I become a genius. Otherwise,
it's a shame.
No, I know. I mean, we'd have a lot of Nobel Prize winners at the Olympics if that was the case. But what's, I think, more interesting to us is that exercise has a very specific regional effect on the brain. So different regions of the brain might become more active or less active depending on what you're doing, what type of exercise, what intensity of exercise, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting to us is to be able to identify what parts of the brain are doing what. Because if I say, for example, from our research in kids, I know that if I get them to jump up and down for 15 to 30 minutes, then they'll sit down and their attention will be a lot better. They're better able to engage in what they're doing. But if I have a law enforcement worker and they have to run up a flight of stairs, so that's maximal exertion, and then they have to stop and make a decision within a split second, I know that if they're not fit enough to sustain that ramp up the stairs, their inhibition will be impaired for a couple of minutes. And so you need to make sure that they're fit enough to be able to sustain that level of exertion and make sure that the brain has not become too impulsive to make the wrong decision at the wrong time.
It makes you think all the kind of physical training that goes into emergency services, everything they're doing is quite urgent and has quite a lot of time pressure. But actually another big part of that is the decision they need to make on the other end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we really want to take care of our emergency workers. Because they're taking care of us.
Yeah, literally.
Literally. And they're putting their bodies through so much strain, not just physically. So for some job, it is physically draining. But the shift patterns and the night's work and all of that impacts our brain. So what we're trying to do in our lab is trying to understand how can we best make physical activity and nutrition recommendations for shift workers and emergency workers to make sure that we're supporting their brain health throughout life, because unfortunately not sleeping well and having a shift job for many years is not great for our brain health later in life, and this all comes back to us in our 50s and 60s is where we start to see the detrimental effects. But we also want them to be able to perform at their best on the job during the shifts. And we're seeing that physical movement can help quite considerably, both during a shift and to support brain health longer term in this population.
When you say shift patterns, what does that actually do to your brain? Why does that affect you differently to working in the day?
It's a very interesting one because if you think from the obvious point of view, you're sleep deprived. So you're moving your circadian rhythm around. And some people might say, actually, you know what, I'm fine. I have a cup of coffee and I perform just fine on the job throughout the night. And there is some very interesting research that shows that if you ask shift workers how they think they're performing throughout their night shift, but then you also give them some cognitive tests to get an objective measure of performance, actually they're performing worse than they think they are. The good news, and there's always good news, is that changing dietary patterns and physical activity patterns can support cognition throughout the shift to make sure that you don't have this mismatch between how well you think you are making your decisions and what's actually happening in your brain.
Yeah, I guess if you're a doctor making important decisions, it's not great to have that discrepancy
with
what you're actually doing.
Exactly. But, and our doctors and nurses know this, and they do make sure that they are doing the best they can to make sure that they are staying healthy and alert throughout the shift. So I wouldn't worry.
So I think another demographic of people you could maybe consider shift workers in that they're sometimes nocturnal is students. Do you see sleep work pattern affect them as well?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I have had students confess to me that they're not coming to my 9 a.m. lectures because they're playing video games all night.
Or at the SU. probably.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Really appreciate the honesty. No, absolutely. So we're doing some really fun work with our students to try to understand exactly that. So circadian rhythm and I guess body clocks in students, and trying to understand, when a student says, "Oh, I'm an early morning person," or "I'm a late night person," well, does that actually mean that maybe you should be timing when you study throughout the day, or is that somehow affecting your health behaviors? So we've been working with students. I decided to tag my students because if you're not coming to class, I'm going to put a monitor on you and see what you're doing throughout the day.
We need to know what's going on there.
Absolutely. So very grateful for our students to volunteer for the study. And we're finding some really interesting patterns. So students who self-report as very early morning people tend to do their exercise early in the morning, and then that tails off throughout the day. Our late night students tend to do their exercise session in the afternoon. So that's it. It's quite interesting that it fits with how they say they feel and they perform. Their mood follows the same pattern. So they're definitely reporting feeling more alert in the morning versus the evening. But what was unexpected was that the extreme late night students were just much more sedentary throughout the entire day, throughout the whole week. So they weren't really doing any physical activity at all. And this does relate to lots of research that's out there on circadian rhythm, where unfortunately all the studies tend to be cross-sectional. So there's, I guess, a correlation between people who are extreme late nights and dietary patterns. So they tend to have poor dietary patterns, tend to be more sedentary, tend to be, I guess, more depressed. And you think correlation, not causation. What direction is this relationship going in? It's very possible that these are people who are not feeling very well in the first place, and that's what keeps them up at night. So what we tried to do then is, what can we do to support our students who feel like they are late night and they're staying up all night, and then during the day they can't concentrate in the lecture, because we've seen the same with our cognitive tests. So we gave them cognitive tests throughout the day, and again we're seeing our early morning people seem to be performing better and our extreme late night people not as well. What we're finding in that same data is that actually the students who do a bit of exercise, particularly in the morning, then tend to perform better at a cognitive level throughout the day. And this effect, so I guess the question is always, how long does the effect last?
Yeah.
Right? So if I do a bit of exercise, I know that for the next half an hour I'll be more alert, but at what point did that tail off? The biggest effect is within 2 hours after you've exercised, if you do at least 15 minutes of a good moderate to vigorous session. So you want to raise your heart rate. And that after 5 hours starts to tail off. So you can see how applying that either to students or just to working people, if you want to be alert for your meeting, if you can, you don't need to go for a run or you don't need to go to a gym, but if you can maybe do a very brisk walk and raise your heart rate for 10 to 15 minutes, that's probably enough to have an effect for maybe a couple of hours after your session. So we thought that was really positive. And we see, if we're looking at what we mentioned earlier about the diversity of the impact of exercise on the brain and cognitive function, we see an impact on creativity, which is fantastic. So improved creativity after people have exercised. We also see an increase in confidence, which is quite funny. So people think they're doing better, but they're not.
Interesting. There's that discrepancy again, like with the doctors.
Yes, so that's a very good point. And I think exercise just gives you this arousal and confidence in yourself where you think, oh my God, I'm having the best idea and I get this on my run every time. So we see effects on creativity and on attention, as I mentioned earlier, but also on speed processing. So how quickly we process information improves after we've done a bit of exercise.
So back to the Olympics, the rugby sevens were one of the sports that gathered a lot of attention, particularly in the women. And I think that's very much down to the US's Ilona Maher, who is absolutely hilarious on TikTok, if you haven't seen her already.
She's fantastic.
She's wonderful. Obviously a great rugby player as well, but I think uses her platform really well to talk about kind of women in sport and body image and all of those types of things that often kind of get swept under the rug. But rugby is also one of those sports that has a lot of medical things associated with it, particularly a result of how much they kind of have significant knocks to their head and concussions, and there's been a lot of research of this, definitely for men playing the sport, but does that research exist for women as well?
A little. Which is why we're trying to do more in the field and trying to get investment to do more. There's a little bit of research in females, and unfortunately what we're seeing at the moment is that in the very few studies that have studied female athletes' brains, it seems that the picture is a bit worse than in men's brains. So if I backtrack a little bit, in general, across the board, and this is very important, in both males and females, hitting your head against things is not a great thing. And there are sports that don't really exhibit lots of high prevalence of concussions, but you do get a higher incidence of head impacts, even though they're not concussive. So take football, for example. You're heading the ball and you're putting your brain under quite a substantial G-force when you do that. So then you've got boxing. You don't necessarily need to be knocked out, but if you're getting hit repeatedly in the head, it's not great. And there is research that's starting to look into this. And in both males and females, it has a detrimental effect. And this detrimental effect only seems to start to show up later in life in our 50s and 60s. So I think on one end, there's less research in females because there are probably less female retired athletes from certain sports. Because unfortunately, there was less investment in female sports, say 30 years ago. So fortunately, that's improving. I think what's worrying in females is that women do tend to be at greater risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia later in life, particularly after menopause. So in people who do suffer from more severe symptoms in menopause, that tends to be related to changes in brain metabolism, which then kickstarts the whole process of generating the amyloid plaques, which then generates dementia and Alzheimer's, say, 7 to 10 years after that. So unfortunately, we are at greater risk just biologically of
not
cognitive.
much you can do about that.
No, that's not true. I think there is always a positive angle in that even with menopause, for some women HRT works. So there's research around this. It's not for everyone, but physical activity, good sleep, good nutrition, all of these aspects are protective against dementia. And we've just published a review that does show that there are all these studies that look at prevalence of dementia in women after menopause. If these women have been active throughout their life and throughout menopause, their risk of developing dementia can be 50% lower.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
And that's just with 2 hours a week of exercise. I think the highest dose with the biggest effect was something like 5 hours of exercise a week. If you're doing 5 hours, then you're in the best place to reduce your risk quite substantially. So there are things that we can do about this if we make sure that we're careful with our lifestyle. But going back to sports and neurodegeneration, there isn't enough, and the few studies that have looked at it do show greater risk in women. And I think part of what we're trying to understand is also the role of the menstrual cycle in recovery from head impacts and head injury. Throughout the month, we've got all these hormones that go up and down, which scientifically is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it can have either detrimental or protective effects, both on recovery from head injuries and head impact and on other injuries in the body. So there is research that's starting to come out that suggests that, for example, if you sustain a concussion during the luteal phase, which is about a week before bleed, then prognosis tends to be worse. So the recovery from the concussion is worse depending on the phase of the cycle. So I think we need to understand a lot more about the role of these hormones, and who knows what the recommendations will be. I think it's too early to say. For some women, contraception might be the answer. For some women, don't get affected at all. I think there's such a big variability in the rise and fall in these hormones in different women, different cycles, and some women are less affected than others. So I think it's an individualized approach will probably end up being the best way forward. Every woman is different and every woman is fascinating. We need to study ourselves a lot more.
Definitely. But before you get to that point of, unfortunately, injury and recovery from an injury, does your point in the menstrual cycle also affect your usual functioning?
So I love that question. I'm going to start from preconceptions.
Okay.
So what we hear a lot from women in general, society, and athletes is that during menstruation, so days of bleed, several women tend to worry that they might not perform as well if they go on the pitch. So if they have a big game, some athletes say, they're concerned that they're not feeling well. And what we're actually finding in our research is that this doesn't match what we find in objective data. So there is research from colleagues that show that injury incidence is actually much greater in the luteal phase, which is at the end of cycle, not during days of bleed. Days of bleed seem to show the lowest risk or lowest prevalence of injury in the studies that are coming out. And even though women might be concerned that because they're not feeling well, they're not going to perform well, what we're finding in our data in cognitive function is that actually cognitive processes that are relevant to sports seem to be better during days of bleed compared to the luteal phase, for example. So we did a study recently where we wanted to try to understand if this was actually the case. We've got all these athletes saying, during this phase and that phase, I'm not feeling great, so I'm not going to perform well. So we thought, let's study this. Let's see if it's actually true. So we sent cognitive tests to about 300 participants, and what came back was that even though our participants felt worse during days of bleed, they thought they were performing worse on the cognitive tests, but actually their reaction times were faster and they made less mistakes than when they were in the luteal phase.
It's interesting, there's that mismatch again between what people think they're doing and the reality. It's really strange.
Yeah, I think that's what I absolutely love about the outcome of the study, which is not what we were looking for. The study was designed to find a different hypothesis, which I'll get onto in a minute. But I love the fact that you ask these participants, how do you think you performed? And they say, no, it was awful, and my symptoms were negatively affecting my cognitive performance. I say, no, actually, you performed a lot better than you think. And if we speak to the athletes that we work with in football, we sometimes get the same reflection. So before going onto the pitch, they're worried. They think, I'm not going to perform well. But you speak to them after the game, and they did fantastically well and might have scored a beautiful goal, So I think we really need to break down these preconceptions about the cycle impacting us. And I think that's the really important message that we need to put out. No, it doesn't impact us in our functioning throughout the month. And if you go to work and it's a specific phase of your cycle, you're not going to say the wrong thing in a meeting. So it doesn't make us any more or less intelligent in different phases. And I think that's quite important. If we look at it scientifically, cognition does actually change and brain function does change throughout the cycle. It's just not strong enough or significant enough to have an impact in our day-to-day functioning.
Okay.
So I think the two key hormones that you see go up and down are estrogen and progesterone throughout the cycle. We know from studies that have looked at brain activity that estrogen has an excitatory effect on the cerebral cortex. So it essentially makes us think faster. Whereas progesterone has the opposite effect. It has an inhibitory effect on the cerebral cortex, which means it makes us slightly slower in our processes. So you've got these two hormones that kind of antagonize each other in their effects on the brain. And what we're seeing in our research is that in the luteal phase, which is where we or other researchers have reported a greater incidence of non-contact injuries, greater incidence of concussions, greater incidence of musculoskeletal injuries in team sports, where you're in an environment where you have to be aware of everything that's moving around you. There's your body, there's a ball, there's another player, and then there's the goalpost, and you need to constantly be aware of the position of these objects in space and in time. So cognitive processes that relate to that very specific aspect of cognition, which we call timing anticipation. So predicting where an object is going to be in space and time, and then acting on it. So moving within a split second, you need to decide, am I going to go for the tackle or not? Or do I need to move, etc.? Do I try to go for a goal kick? That process seems to be slightly slower in the luteal phase.
Okay.
Where we have higher levels of progesterone, which have an inhibitory effect on the cerebral cortex. And so this is probably why we are seeing slightly slower reaction times. We don't see an increase in errors, so it's not like we're not seeing worse decision making, for example. That's not the case. We're just seeing slightly slower reaction times, which fits with what we see at a physiological level and a neurotransmitter level, essentially. So this is what we think in our lab might be driving the increased risk of injury in the luteal phase, specifically, where you see these changes in cognition. If we have to translate that to day-to-day, so is that going to impact how we perform at work? No, it's not. This is a difference in timing of movements of 10 to 20 milliseconds, which is very, very small and specific. Important for a contact sport, not so important for writing an email.
It's fascinating that there are so many things going on below the surface, particularly in these kind of team sports, so football, I'm guessing rugby as well. So many factors are coming into play, which I guess kind of makes it even more amazing when things go right and you see these incredible goals or you see this amazing set play that works really well, that it's kind of in spite of all these insane things happening in your body that you can still pull off something like that.
Yeah, I think the human body is incredible, and the human brain. I think we're so resilient. You know, we're talking today about the impact of our fitness level on our brain function and changes in hormone levels and whatnot. And as a scientist, I find this fascinating. But actually, we just, you know how Nike says, just do it? That's how we should be approaching challenges. I think it doesn't matter if you know your strength level isn't at your optimal. It doesn't matter if you're not feeling great. That's not going to impact how you're going to perform on the day. Sometimes just focusing on the task at hand. You know, sometimes athletes get a personal best or they smash a record when they weren't expecting to. And I love how resilient the human body is and how adaptable the brain is. You can be missing a part of your brain and the rest of the brain will learn to do what's been removed in surgery. I mean, I know I'm going a complete tangent here.
It's fascinating though.
It is, it's absolutely fascinating. And even, you know, going back to the shift work, yes, you're sleep deprived and fine, yes, that can impact your cognitive function. But if you're faced with a very challenging situation, your brain will switch on and will focus. Your body will start to produce all the adrenaline and the dopamine that it needs to get through that decision and do it well, which is why doctors and nurses and law enforcement officers do perform well, even though they're working throughout the night and they are saving our lives and taking care of us.
So we've obviously spoken about a variety of different sports and different types of exercise you can do and how it benefits us. But does it affect every person individually in the same way?
Oh, I love that you said that, because I think individual differences are so important. And I think we forget that we are working with individuals in research. We kind of put everybody into one big group and say, okay, yeah, at group level, we see an improvement. But actually there is so much variability in the responses that people get to exercise. One of the things that we noticed, which was quite fun, was personality differences. So different personalities seem to engage in exercise in different ways. One thing we spoke about earlier about introverts and extroverts and the social facilitation effect and being watched. And so I think that kind of links into what type of sports a person might be interested in doing. But we also get personality differences in intensity of exercise and how much people enjoy different intensities. So, for example, people who seem to be very extroverted really enjoy high intensity exercise. So they seem to draw a bigger mood boost or greater enjoyment from doing something that's like a HIIT session, so a high intensity interval session, or going, maxing out on a run. And that for them seems to be what gives them the biggest mood boost, and that, they feel amazing afterwards. And this does have to do with the structure of our brain and how our brain processes sensory information. Extroverts need arousal, they seek arousal, and that's why they tend to wear bright colors or tend to be around people, or from an exercise perspective, they want the high intensity boost. Whereas introverts tend to be very sensitive to stimuli and to arousal, and that's why they don't necessarily need to be around lots of people or loud noises, because their brain is quite sensitive to that information and how they process it. So an introvert will be quite happy with any intensity of exercise, really. It's not like they need to do lower intensities. But extroverts specifically seem to enjoy these really hard sessions. But then there's also other aspects like conscientiousness, a person who's more or less disciplined and what they value in life. So if I'm a person who values my health a lot, I might be driven to exercise purely because I know it's good for my health. I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'll do my little session because I know it's good for me. And I draw a mood boost from that because I know I've done something that's good for me. In fact, that's something that we see in our data, is that people who are very conscientious tend to have a very good, well-rounded fitness. So they're fit from an endurance perspective, they're fit from a strength perspective. So, they do everything that they know they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Whereas extroverts will just be really, really good at the one sport they love, and that's it.
I guess the motivations vary, and that kind of affects what you see.
They absolutely do. It's the motivations, and also I think how we engage in exercise. So people who score high on a trait called neuroticism, which is not a disease. It simply means that people are more likely to be anxious and to ruminate a lot. So someone who scores high on that personality trait tends to just want to be left alone. So they're fine doing high intensities, they're fine doing any sort of intensity of exercise, but they'd rather not be monitored, is one thing that we've learned. So if we are working, we have a family member that we really want them to get to exercise and we just can't. And usually the wrong thing to do is to say, right, I'm going to get you on Strava and I'm going to help you and I'm going to check everything you're doing and give you recommendations. I'm just going to put them off. So I think that's really interesting, because understanding personality differences allows us to engage with our family and friends in a different way and make the right recommendations to support them to become more active. The best recommendation I can give people is just move. Just do something, and do something you enjoy. If it's Zumba, make it Zumba. If it's yoga, then do that. It doesn't really matter. I think what is more important is that you enjoy the form of movement that you're doing. And I think at a societal level, there's this misconception about the word sporty, which I really don't like. I think it's so narrow because we associate the word sporty with maybe football and rugby, and that's it. But I might love dancing, and so does that mean I'm not fit or not active? So I hope we will start to move away from those labels and just talk about movement and physical activity rather than sports, which is so important. And I think another thing that we've learned from our research is that at a physiological level, that also determines how much you draw from exercise. So if a person is quite sedentary and doesn't currently engage in exercise, then any form of structured exercise is going to be difficult because you're not used to it. You don't sometimes know what it feels like for your heart to get to 190, and so sometimes that can be scary. So starting by going straight into, a couch to 5K or a group class might not be the best way to get a person active if they're not active at the moment. But the really good news is that the fitter and the leaner we become, the more benefit we start to draw from exercise, both from a mood perspective and from a cognitive perspective. So linking back to what we were saying earlier, the minimum amount of exercise you need to, let's say, wake up your brain is 15 minutes of a moderate intensity session, which everybody can do. If you do an intensity of 4 out of 10, that's the minimum amount of activity that we see starts to have an effect on mood as well as on cognitive function. And that's quite light. That's like, a light cycle to work or a brisk walk, something like that. But the great news is that the fitter we become, our body for some reason learns or is able to draw much more benefit from exercise. And there's a couple of processes. One we talked about, which is this endocannabinoid system in the brain. But there's something else that we can measure in humans and that we are seeing quite a lot is the release of BDNF. So we talked about BDNF earlier. It's a hormone that enables or supports brain health, but also supports cognitive function in the short term. And what we are seeing in our research in our lab, but also lots of other colleagues across the world, are seeing is that fitter people release more of this hormone when they exercise. So this is a hormone that supports memory quite a lot, but we're also seeing links to attention and inhibition. So we're learning more about it at the moment. But the great news is that the more muscle mass we build and the more efficient our cardiovascular system becomes, the more of this hormone we release in the immediate response to exercise.
So your body kind of helps itself, really?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. And I think even things like changes in inflammatory process, we know inflammation is so bad for the brain. But we know from lots of research that the fitter we become, the lower the inflammation in our body. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if a person's very sedentary and you think, I really can't be bothered to go on a run, just move, just do a bit of exercise. And as the body becomes fitter, your brain will start to draw more of that mood boost and cognitive boost. And that only takes 6 weeks for things to get a lot better. It's not a lot of time. So stick with it for a couple of months and you'll see massive benefits.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you feel as inspired as we do by Flaminia to get moving and help your brain and body at the same time. If you want to check out more science, head to rigb.org to browse all our upcoming talks from more amazing speakers.